They say home is where the heart is, but what happens when the people you love sell your heart for money? My name is Margaret. I'm 71 years old. And 3 years ago, while I was lying in a hospital bed fighting for my life, my own children sold the house I built with my hands and my dreams. But this isn't a story about loss. It's a story about finding peace, the kind that can't be bought or stolen. I bought that little brick house when I was 31. Back then, it wasn't much, just 2 bedrooms and a broken fence, but it was mine. I raised my children there. Every wall had a memory, every corner, a secret. When my husband died, that house became my anchor. It was where I learned how to live again. I kept his tools in the garage, his photo above the kitchen sink, just where he liked to watch the sunrise. People talk about moving on, but some places, they hold you like family. That home did that for me. I never imagined the ones I trusted most would see it as nothing more than property. It started small, little things I ignored. My son, Daniel, asking about the property papers. My daughter, Leanne, mentioning how expensive it was to maintain. I thought they were just concerned. You see, when you're a mother, you want to believe your children mean well, even when the truth whispers otherwise. Then came the stroke. One cold morning in January, I collapsed in the kitchen. The doctors said I was lucky, a few minutes later, and I wouldn't have made it. But lying there in that hospital, half conscious, I wasn't thinking about death. I was thinking about home. Would the plants survive the frost? Did I lock the back door? Silly things like that keep you alive, you know? I was in the hospital for 7 weeks. 7 weeks of tubes, beeping machines, and quiet prayers at night. My children visited, but something in their eyes was different. Polite smiles, rushed conversations, as if they were somewhere else. I didn't understand. Not then. When I finally returned home, I found the truth waiting for me in a plain white envelope. A letter from the city council. It said the ownership of my house had been transferred. Transferred. My children had sold my home while I was still in that hospital bed. They told me it was for my own good, that I needed care, that the house was too big, that it was time to move on. But all I heard was the sound of betrayal. My name had been erased from the only place that ever knew me completely. For weeks, I couldn't even cry. Grief has many faces. Sometimes it just sits in silence, heavy as stone. I stayed with a neighbor for a while, pretending I was fine, but every night I stared at the ceiling, wondering how love turns into greed so quietly. One morning, I woke before dawn and watched the sky go from black to gold. That was the moment I decided. They could take my house, but not my peace. Not again. I began walking every day just to feel the ground under my feet again. I saved what little money I had from my pension, sold the jewelry I never wore, and started sewing again, something I hadn't done since my 20s. It wasn't much, but it gave me purpose, and slowly the pain turned into direction. I moved to a small town by the coast, a place no one in my family even knew existed. I rented a single room above a bakery, helped out part-time, and sewed in the evenings. The baker's wife, a kind woman named Helen, used to say, "You've got magic in those hands, Margaret." Maybe she was right, because within a year people started buying my work. One order became 10. 10 became 50, and one day I realized I could build again. Not a house of brick and walls, but a home of my own making. So I bought a small piece of land on the edge of town, nothing fancy, just a patch of wild grass near the sea. With the help of a few local workers, I built a modest cottage, 1 room at a time. White walls, wide windows, wooden floors that creaked when I laughed too hard. I called it Grace House, not after me, but after what it gave me, grace. Now, 3 years later, I sit on the porch every evening drinking tea and watching the waves. Sometimes I think of my children. I don't hate them. Hate is just another chain that keeps you from moving on, but I don't let them in either. They've called, of course, their voices softer now, their words full of nostalgia and guilt. They ask if they can visit just to see how I'm doing, but I tell them, gently, This house is not for visitors, it's for those who never left me when I was broken. They sold my home for money. I built one with peace, and that is a kind of revenge they'll never understand. Because forgiveness isn't about letting them back in, it's about walking away without bitterness in your heart. I used to think my house was my story. Now I know I was the story all along, and I'm still here. Still standing, still home. Sometimes when the sea is quiet and the air smells of salt and pine, I sit outside and close my eyes. I can still hear the laughter that once filled that old house. Daniel running down the hallway with muddy shoes, Leanne singing to the radio while helping me cook dinner. Those sounds don't hurt anymore. They visit like gentle ghosts, then drift away. But there are nights when the ache still comes. Nights when I wonder if I could have done something different. Maybe I gave too much. Maybe I trusted too easily. Mothers are taught to give until there's nothing left. And when you do, people start believing you'll never stop. That's the hardest part of growing older. Realizing that the people you raised have learned how to live without you, but not how to value you. After I finished building Grace House, I promised myself one thing. I would never build something again just to be needed. Whatever I create now, my home, my garden, my friendships, they will exist because they make me feel alive, not useful. Helen, the baker's wife, still brings me bread every Sunday. We sit by the kitchen window, watching the tide, talking about everything and nothing. Sometimes young tourists walk by and wave, and she tells them, "That's Margaret. She built this house herself." And I smile, because it's true. But one afternoon, something unexpected happened. A letter arrived. No return address, just my name written in Daniel's handwriting. I stared at it for a long time before opening it. It wasn't long, just a few lines. He wrote that things had fallen apart between him and Leanne, that the money from the house was gone, that he missed me, that he was sorry. I sat there for hours holding that piece of paper like it was something fragile. Maybe it was. Sorry. Such a small word for so much damage. And yet, a part of me wanted to believe it. I didn't respond right away. Instead, I went for a walk by the shore, letting the cold wind sting my cheeks. I thought about the woman I was before, the one who would have rushed to comfort him, to fix everything, to open her doors and her heart again. But I'm not that woman anymore. The sea teaches you things, you know. It teaches you that waves will always come, but you don't have to drown in each one. You can stand, let them hit you, and still remain. So I wrote him back, just one line. I hope you find peace, the way I did. No anger, no guilt. Just truth. Days turned into weeks, and I didn't hear back. But one morning, as I tended to the small rose bush outside my porch, I found a package near the steps. Inside was an old photograph, our family, standing in front of the house they sold. On the back, Daniel had written, "Home isn't the place, it's the person who held it together." I sat down, and for the first time in years, I cried, not from pain, but from release. Because, maybe, finally, he understood. Still, I didn't invite him here. Grace House isn't a place for guilt to rest. It's a place built from peace, quiet, earned, and mine. But sometimes I imagine him standing at the edge of the driveway, unsure if he should knock. I imagine what I'd say if he did. Maybe I'd pour 2 cups of tea. Maybe we'd sit in silence listening to the sea. Maybe forgiveness doesn't always need words, just distance and time. I've learned that revenge isn't fire. It's peace, the kind that burns quietly while the world wonders how you healed without them. And in that silence, I found myself again. The garden's bigger now. I've planted wild lavender near the window, and the bees have made it their home. The house smells like sunlight and soap. Every morning when I open the curtains, I whisper to the air, "This is mine." Every bit of it. Sometimes I wonder if my children will ever see it, not just the house, but the life I built from what they broke, and part of me hopes they do. Not to make them regret, but to make them understand. A few months passed after that letter. The days settled into their quiet rhythm again, mornings with tea and soft music, afternoons spent sewing by the window, evenings wrapped in the orange light of the sea. Then, one late afternoon, I saw a figure standing at the edge of the garden path. The sun was low, blinding, and for a moment, I thought it was just a traveler stopping for directions. But then he spoke. "Mom, it was Daniel." He looked older than I remembered, thinner, slower, with that same nervous hand movement he had as a boy when he didn't know what to say. I didn't move right away. The air between us felt like glass, fragile, dangerous, reflecting everything we hadn't said in years. He took a hesitant step forward. "I didn't know if you'd be here," he said quietly. "I've been looking for you." I could have told him that I wasn't hiding, that he just hadn't been looking in the right way. But instead, I said nothing. He looked around at the garden, the porch, the fresh coat of white paint. "You built this?" he asked. I nodded. He exhaled, a sound caught between disbelief and regret. "It's beautiful," he whispered. "You always had that touch." For a moment, it almost felt normal, like we were back in that old kitchen, like time had folded in on itself. But then he looked down, and the silence between us broke open again. "I made a mess of things," he said finally. "Leanne and I, we thought we were doing the right thing. We thought we could help you. But I see now, we just wanted to help ourselves." His voice cracked, and I could see, behind all the words, a man who had lost more than money, someone who'd been running from the sound of his own choices. He stepped closer, his eyes searching mine. "I know I can't fix it. I just wanted you to know, I'm sorry, I really am." The wind shifted. The smell of salt and jasmine filled the air. For a moment, I wanted to reach out, to hold his face, like I used to when he was small and scared. But my hands stayed by my side. "Daniel," I said softly, "you didn't just sell a house. You sold trust, and that doesn't rebuild as easily as walls." He nodded, tears welling. "I know." We stood there in the fading light, two people bound by blood and distance. He glanced at the porch steps, the empty chair beside mine. "Can I sit?" he asked. I hesitated. The years of hurt whispered against my chest, but something in his voice, quiet, humble, felt different this time. I nodded. He sat down slowly, like a guest in someone else's life. For a while, neither of us spoke. The waves did all the talking, steady, endless, patient. "I didn't think you'd ever want to see me again," he said. "I didn't know if I wanted to," I replied. And that was the truth. We both looked out toward the horizon, the sky painted gold and violet. He told me about his job, how it fell apart after the sale, how he tried to start something new but couldn't shake the guilt. He said Leanne had moved abroad and they hadn't spoken in months. He said he felt empty. I listened, quietly. Every word felt heavy but not cruel. Just real. Then he looked at me and said, "You were always stronger than any of us." I smiled faintly. "No," I said. "I just learned how to stand when I had no one left to lean on." He lowered his head, eyes shining. "I wish I'd learned that from you sooner." The sky dimmed. The first stars appeared. We sat there, not as mother and son, not as betrayer and betrayed, but as two people trying to find a language softer than blame. I poured him a cup of tea. He took it with shaking hands. For a long while, we said nothing. But in that silence, something shifted. Not forgiveness, not yet, but the beginning of understanding, the kind that comes not from words but from the quiet acknowledgement of shared pain. The waves kept moving, the light kept fading, and we just sat there. Two lives, once broken apart, finding their breath again, slowly, carefully, without promises. The night gathered around us, wrapping everything in soft blue, and for the first time in years, I didn't feel alone. The next morning came quietly, carried by the sound of gulls and the slow rhythm of the tide. I woke before sunrise, as I always did, and stepped outside with my cup of tea. The air was cool, soft, the kind that smells like dew and new beginnings. Daniel was already there. He'd slept on the porch, wrapped in an old blanket I kept for guests. I hadn't offered it to him. He must have found it himself. For a moment, I just watched him. His face was calm in sleep, gentler somehow, stripped of all the pride and exhaustion I remembered. When he stirred, he smiled, embarrassed. "I didn't mean to fall asleep here," he said. I shrugged. "It's not the worst place to rest." He followed me into the garden without being asked. It surprised me. Years ago, he'd hated chores. Now he knelt beside me, helping loosen the soil around the lavender roots. He didn't talk much, and that was fine. Sometimes silence is the only way to start again. After a while, he said, "Leanne wanted to come." She didn't know if she should. I didn't answer right away. The name still carried too much weight, too many unfinished sentences. He continued, "She's been working overseas. Things didn't turn out like she planned. I think she's scared you'll never forgive her." I pressed my hands into the earth, feeling its cool steadiness. "Forgiveness isn't something you ask for," I said. "It's something you earn quietly." He nodded. We kept working, the garden filling with the soft sounds of tools, soil, and sea breeze. He glanced around at the flowers, the wooden fence, the small cottage behind us. "You've made something beautiful here," he said. I looked up at him. "I made something peaceful." He smiled faintly. I'd forgotten there was a difference. The sun climbed higher, spilling light across the porch. Inside, the kettle began to whistle. I went in to make breakfast, and he followed, careful, respectful, like he was stepping into a sacred place. While the tea steeped, I noticed him looking at the framed photographs on the shelf. Old ones, my wedding day, the children as toddlers, me holding them in the garden of that first house. He picked one up and stared at it. "I didn't realize how young you were," he said softly. "You must have been my age." "Life was simpler then," I said. He nodded. "And we made it complicated." He sat down at the small table, folding his hands. "Do you ever think about selling this place?" he asked. I laughed, not cruelly, but with a weary kind of humor. "No, this one doesn't have a price." He looked down, a hint of shame flickering across his face. I guess I needed to hear that. We ate quietly, bread, honey, and the tea that smelled faintly of mint. It reminded me of the mornings when he was small and would chatter endlessly about everything he dreamed of becoming. I used to believe I could protect him from the world. Now I understood that sometimes you have to let the world teach your children what you couldn't. After breakfast, he offered to fix the broken step on the porch. I almost told him no, but something inside me said, "Let him." So I watched as he fetched the tools, measuring carefully, working in silence. He wasn't the same man who'd left me years ago. I could see it in the way he moved, slower, humbler, present. While he worked, I tended to the small rosemary bush near the fence. The smell drifted between us, clean, sharp, familiar. When he finished, he wiped his hands and looked at me. "There," he said. "It won't wobble anymore," I smiled. "Good." "Maybe it was waiting for you." He hesitated, then sat beside me on the steps. "Do you think she'll ever talk to me again?" he asked quietly, meaning Leanne. "Maybe," I said. "Time softens more things than we expect. But you can't rush it. Some people need to see the tide change before they believe it's safe to come back." He nodded, lost in thought. For a long while, we just sat there, the wind carrying the sound of distant waves. Then he said something I didn't expect. "I used to think revenge meant winning, taking back what was yours. But watching you here, I think I get it now. Revenge can be peace. Just living better." I looked at him, really looked. He wasn't asking for forgiveness this time. He was trying to understand the language of quiet strength, the one I had spent years learning. I didn't answer. I didn't need to. He understood. The day stretched long and slow, golden with sun and memory. And as we worked side by side, him mending the fence, me planting new seeds, I felt something begin to settle, something that had been restless for years. It wasn't forgiveness, not yet, but it was the space where forgiveness might one day live. That afternoon, while Daniel was repairing the small gate at the end of the garden, I heard the sound of a car approaching. It was unusual. Few people ever came this far down the road. The tires crunched slowly on the gravel, stopping just beyond the lavender hedge. I wiped my hands on my apron and stepped out to see who it was, a small silver car. The door opened, and when she stepped out, my breath caught. Leanne. She stood there for a moment, unsure if she should move closer. Her hair was shorter, streaked with gray, her eyes tired in a way I'd never seen before. In her hands, she held a bunch of white lilies, my favorite, though she couldn't have known that anymore. Daniel froze when he saw her. His hammer slipped from his hand. None of us spoke. The only sound was the sea and the soft flutter of wings overhead. Finally, she took a step forward. "Mom," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, "I didn't know if you'd want to see me. I didn't answer right away." The years between us hung thick in the air, too many words unspoken, too many apologies buried under time. She looked smaller somehow, like the world had carved her down to something fragile. "I heard from Daniel that you were here," she continued. "I almost didn't come. But I needed to." Her eyes glistened, though she tried to hold her composure. She offered me the flowers, her hands trembling slightly. "For you," she said. I took them, not because I was ready, but because they were offered with trembling honesty. "Thank you," I said quietly. Daniel stepped forward, hesitant. "I didn't tell her to come," he murmured. "I know," I replied. Leanne looked between us, her voice breaking. "I've thought about this day for a long time. Every time I passed a house that reminded me of yours, I felt it all over again. What we did. What I did." The words spilled out, halting and uneven. I told myself we were helping you. That it was too much for you to live alone, that it was practical. But it wasn't about helping, it was about control. About wanting things to fit my idea of right. Her eyes filled with tears, and she shook her head. "I see it now. The house wasn't just a place, it was your life. And I took it without asking." I said nothing. I let her words hang there, heavy, raw, and true. Daniel walked over slowly, standing beside her. For a long moment, they looked like the children they once were. The same faces I had kissed goodnight 1,000 times, now older, cracked by choices and time. I gestured toward the porch. "Come sit," I said softly. They followed me up the path, silent, careful. Inside, the air smelled of bread and rosemary. I placed the lilies in a vase of water and set it on the table. Their pale petals glowed in the afternoon light, like little pieces of calm in a storm. Leanne looked around the cottage, her eyes tracing every detail, the handmade curtains, the books stacked neatly, the quiet order of a life rebuilt. "It's beautiful," she whispered. I nodded. "It's enough." We sat there, 3 people bound by love, mistakes, and the slow work of mending. Leanne clasped her hands tightly. "I don't expect forgiveness," she said. "I just wanted to face what we did. I didn't want to hide from it anymore." Daniel reached for her hand. She let him. The sight of it, my 2 children holding on to each other after all these years, made something stir deep in my chest. I poured 3 cups of tea. No one spoke for a while. The tea steamed between us, carrying the faint scent of mint and honey. It was strange how quiet could be so full of meaning. Finally, Leanne asked, "Do you ever miss the old house?" I smiled faintly. "Sometimes." But then I remember, it wasn't the house that mattered, it was what I became after losing it. She looked down, her tears slipping silently onto her hands. "I'm glad you found peace," she whispered. I nodded. I did, but peace isn't something you find once. You have to keep choosing it. Outside, the wind began to rise, brushing through the lavender and the trees. Daniel stood and looked out the window. "The tide's coming in," he said quietly. Leanne rose too, moving beside him. They watched the water together, brother and sister, side by side again after years apart. And for the first time in a long time, I felt the weight in the air begin to shift. Not gone, not healed, but lighter, like the beginning of something that could grow if we let it. Leanne turned back to me, her eyes soft but searching. "Would it be all right if I stayed a little while?" she asked. "Just to help with the garden, maybe." I studied her face, the lines of regret, the sincerity beneath the weariness. The part of me that had closed its doors began to stir, uncertain but curious. "We'll see," I said gently. "The garden has its own way of deciding who belongs in it." She nodded, understanding more than the words themselves. The three of us stepped outside again, into the pale light. The sea glimmered beyond the hill, and the lavender swayed softly in the wind. For the first time in years, we stood together, not as the family we once were, but as the people time had shaped us into. And though the silence still held its ache, it no longer felt empty. It felt alive. Leanne stayed. Not because we planned it, it just happened. After that first afternoon, she asked if she could help me tend the garden. The next morning, she showed up wearing an old flannel shirt and a pair of gloves 2 sizes too big. She wasn't sure where to start, and I didn't tell her. I just handed her a small spade and said, "Follow the sun." She smiled a little, confused but willing. The first day, we worked in silence. The second, she started asking questions, small ones at first. "How often do you water the rosemary? Do you grow these from seeds?" And then, slowly, the questions turned into pieces of conversation that had nothing to do with the plants. She told me about her life abroad, the long hours, the loneliness, how she thought success would make her feel safe, but instead it made her feel hollow. "I kept chasing things that looked like happiness," she said, pressing her fingers into the soil. "But they never stayed. I didn't give her advice. I just listened. The soil between us did the talking." Daniel stayed, too, for a few days at first, then longer. He fixed what needed fixing, quietly, without being asked. The old fence, the loose shutter, the broken hinge on the kitchen cabinet. Sometimes I'd catch him standing in the doorway, watching me and Leanne working side by side. He didn't say anything, but his eyes softened in a way that spoke of quiet gratitude. At night, the three of us would sit on the porch, each lost in our thoughts. The air would fill with the hum of crickets, the sea breathing in the distance. We didn't talk much about the past, not yet. It was too tender, like a wound that needed air before it could close. One evening, Leanne brought her guitar, the same one she used to play when she was a teenager. Her voice trembled at first, but as the song went on, it found its strength again. It was an old tune, one my husband used to hum when he worked in the garden. Daniel leaned back, eyes closed. I felt tears press at the corners of my eyes but didn't wipe them away. Some memories deserve to live exactly as they are, raw, imperfect, alive. When the song ended, none of us spoke for a while. Then Leanne whispered, "I forgot what it felt like to just be here." And I said softly, "Being here is harder than it looks, but it's worth it." The next morning I woke to the sound of laughter, real laughter, the kind that comes from the belly, not the throat. I looked out the window and saw them, Daniel and Leanne, trying to build a small trellis for the vines. The wood was uneven, the nails bent, and they were both covered in dirt. But they were laughing, together. For a long time I just stood there, watching. The sight filled something in me I hadn't realized was still empty. Later, over lunch, Daniel said, "You know, I thought this place would feel small, but it doesn't." "It feels full?" Leanne nodded, smiling faintly. "It feels alive." I looked at them, their faces warm in the afternoon light. "Grace House has a way of doing that," I said. "It only grows what's meant to stay." They exchanged a glance, one of those silent understandings that siblings have, and then Leanne said, "Maybe that's what we needed. A place to grow again." We spent the rest of the day clearing a small patch of land near the back fence. Leanne wanted to plant herbs, mint, thyme, maybe sage. Daniel suggested vegetables. I just smiled. "Plant what you'll care for. The garden knows when it's loved." The sun began to set, painting everything gold. I watched them working together, awkward, a little clumsy, but united in a rhythm that hadn't existed between them for years. For the first time since that letter arrived, I felt the smallest spark of something gentle in my chest. Not forgiveness yet, but something that sounded like the beginning of it. As the sky deepened to blue, I stood at the porch, holding my cup of tea. The smell of earth and salt filled the air. Daniel was humming softly, and Leanne was tucking the last of the seedlings into the soil. The world felt still. Not fixed, not finished, but still. And in that quiet, I realized something. Sometimes the people who broke you aren't meant to disappear. Sometimes they return, not to take, but to witness the person you became without them. I didn't know how long they'd stay. Maybe a few days, maybe more. But for now, their presence didn't feel like a burden. It felt like a season returning, cautious, tender, unsure of its welcome, but real. The garden would decide what came next. It always did. The days began to blend softly into one another, slow mornings, quiet afternoons, and evenings filled with that golden hush that only coastal air can hold. Daniel had taken to waking early, sometimes before me, walking down to the shore and returning with sea-worn driftwood. He'd stack it near the fence, saying he might build something one day, maybe benches, maybe a table. I didn't press him. Sometimes a man needs a project before he can find his peace. Leanne spent her mornings in the garden. She'd hum to the plants, little melodies, half-forgotten lullabies. The herbs she planted had begun to sprout, small green whispers against the brown soil. I'd catch her smiling at them like they were promises coming true. I found myself talking more, little by little. Not about the pain, not yet, but about things that lived safely in the past, the kind of stories that hold both laughter and ache. One afternoon, as I was trimming the lavender, Daniel asked, "Do you ever think about going back to the old town?" I paused, pruning shears in hand. "No," I said finally. "Some places close their doors behind you. That's how you know you're done." He nodded slowly. "I guess I've been waiting for doors to reopen that shouldn't." There was something in his voice, not regret exactly, but awareness, the kind that only comes after losing too much. Later that day, the three of us sat by the small fire pit Daniel had built from the driftwood. The flames flickered low, painting our faces in amber light. Leanne poured tea, her hands steady now. We didn't talk about the past. We didn't need to. The silence between us had changed. It wasn't sharp anymore. It had softened, like fabric worn smooth with time. She looked at me and said quietly, "Do you ever get tired of being strong?" The question caught me off guard. I stared into the fire for a long moment before answering. "Strength isn't a choice after a while," I said. "It becomes a habit. You stop noticing the weight until someone asks if you're tired." She looked down, nodding. "I think I made you carry too much." And all I said was, "We all did what we knew at the time." A gull cried overhead, and the wind shifted, carrying the smell of salt and rosemary. The fire crackled gently, breaking the silence. That night, I couldn't sleep. I walked to the porch, barefoot, the floorboards cool beneath my feet. The moonlight spilled over the garden, silver and soft. The herbs shimmered faintly, and the waves whispered somewhere beyond the hill. Then I saw them, Daniel and Leanne, sitting by the trellis they'd built earlier that week. They were talking quietly, voices low and gentle. I couldn't hear the words, but I could feel what they meant, and I thought maybe this is how healing really happens. Not through grand gestures or apologies, but through simple presence, staying, showing up, planting new things together. The next morning, I found a small wooden sign staked near the new herb bed. It said, "For what we almost lost." The handwriting was Daniel's. I stood there for a long while, my throat tight, my hands trembling just a little. Then I reached down and touched the soil. It was warm, alive. Maybe the earth forgives faster than people do. Days passed like that, quietly, steadily. The house began to fill with laughter again, the kind that starts hesitantly but grows stronger with time. Leanne started cooking in the evenings, filling the kitchen with scents I hadn't known for years. Daniel helped her, teasing her about her clumsy knife skills, and she'd throw him a towel in mock anger. It felt like echoes of an old life I thought I'd buried, only now it was softer, wiser, real. Sometimes I'd just sit back and watch them, not as a mother aching for what was lost, but as a woman grateful for what had returned in another form. And yet, beneath it all, I could still feel something unspoken, a quiet current running beneath our peace. Not everything had been said, not everything had been faced. But maybe that was all right for now. Healing doesn't ask for speed, only patience. The garden was blooming, the air had begun to carry the scent of summer, and the sea outside whispered like it was keeping our secrets. I didn't know where this new chapter would lead, whether they'd stay or leave again. But for the first time in a long while, I wasn't afraid of what came next. The house that once stood as a monument to my solitude was no longer silent. It was breathing again. And somewhere deep inside me, something, maybe forgiveness, maybe peace, was beginning to grow roots. A few evenings later, the rain came, soft at first, then steady, wrapping the house in a rhythm that sounded almost like a lullaby. The three of us sat inside by the window, the warm glow of the lamps flickering against the glass. Outside, the garden shimmered beneath the downpour, each leaf glistening as if the earth itself was cleansing old pain. Leanne was mending a tear in one of my shawls. Daniel was carving something out of driftwood, a habit he'd picked up again, though he never said why. I was knitting, though my hands moved more slowly these days. For a long time, no one spoke. But there was a heaviness in the air, a kind of stillness that always comes before someone finally says what they've been holding back for too long. Leanne broke it first. "I used to tell people you were too proud," she said quietly, not looking up from her stitching. Her voice was steady, but her fingers trembled just a little. "I told them you couldn't admit when you were wrong. But now I think I said that because I couldn't admit when I was." The rain softened, turning into a whisper against the window. I didn't answer right away. I could feel Daniel's eyes flick toward me, waiting. "Finally," I said, "it's easy to mistake silence for pride. But sometimes silence is just survival." Leanne nodded slowly, her needle stilling midair. "I know that now." Daniel set down his carving knife, rubbing his hands together. "I should have protected you," he said suddenly. "When everything happened with the house, I should have stopped it. But I was scared to lose what little I thought I had." He looked at me then, really looked, and in his eyes I saw the same boy who once ran to me after scraping his knee, desperate to be forgiven for falling. "Fear makes cowards of all of us," I said gently, "but we don't stay cowards forever." No one spoke after that. The only sound was the rain, steady, patient. Later, when the lamps had dimmed and the fire was nothing but embers, I found myself unable to sleep again. The memories wouldn't rest, the hospital, the papers I'd signed, the call that told me the house was gone. I walked into the kitchen, where Daniel's carving lay on the table. It was a small wooden bird, unfinished but graceful, wings spread, head tilted upward, as if ready to take flight. There was something tender about it, something unguarded. I ran my fingers over its surface, feeling the rough edges. Then I realized he'd carved it from a piece of wood that once supported the old porch railing. The part he'd replaced weeks ago. He hadn't thrown it away. He'd given it a new shape. I smiled, faintly. Maybe we were all doing the same thing, reshaping what had once been broken, trying to make something that could fly again. The next morning, the storm had passed. The world outside looked washed clean, the sky pale blue, the garden alive with scent and color. Leanne was already outside, barefoot, turning the soil around the herbs. Daniel joined her a few minutes later, his hands tucked in his pockets. They worked side by side, comfortable in their silence. I stood on the porch, watching them, and I thought about how strange time is, how it can stretch, bend, and circle back, bringing people to the same place but not as they were before. There was still so much unsaid, so much that might never be said. But the weight of it felt lighter now. At noon, Daniel called me over. He'd finished the trellis completely, painting it a soft white. Across the top, he'd carved 2 words, "Grace endures." I touched the letters, my fingers tracing the grooves. He said quietly, "I didn't name the house." "You did, but now I understand why." I looked at him, at both of them, and for a brief, wordless moment it felt like all the years between us folded into something small, something gentle. The air was warm, the sea glimmered in the distance, and though I still felt the ache of what was lost, I could finally sense something else rising beside it, something that felt like peace learning to breathe again. The day went on quietly, the kind of day that doesn't demand attention but stays with you all the same. I went inside and placed the wooden bird on the windowsill. Its wings caught the afternoon light, casting a shadow that looked almost like it was flying. And for the first time in years, I whispered to the empty air, "Thank you for coming back." Not to them, not exactly, but to the world, to the moment, to the part of me that had once forgotten how to hope. That night, the moonlight lay soft across my desk. The same small wooden desk I'd had since my teaching days. It had scratches, stains, and faint pen marks, but it still stood firm. Like me. I pulled out my old leather-bound journal, the one I hadn't opened since the hospital. The pages were yellowed at the edges, the ink faded, but the words were still there, my younger self speaking across time. I read a few lines from the last entry. They took the house. But maybe losing walls will help me find my own strength again. I remembered writing that with shaking hands, tears falling onto the page. Back then, I had no idea what strength even looked like. I only knew I had to keep breathing. Now, years later, as I sat at that same desk in a new home that carried my name and my peace, I began to write again. Grace House is alive tonight. The rain has washed the earth clean. My children are asleep in the rooms I built with the last of what I had left. There's laughter here again. Quiet, careful laughter, but real. I thought revenge would mean watching them regret what they did, but I was wrong. True revenge is standing tall in the life they once thought you'd never rebuild. True peace is watching them learn from the silence that used to divide us. I paused, my hand hovering above the paper. The candle beside me flickered, throwing little gold waves across the page. Through the open window, I could hear the sea breathing, steady and constant. And then, faintly, Leanne's voice. She was humming again, a soft tune from childhood. Her door was cracked open. I could see her sitting cross-legged on her bed, sketching something. Daniel was in the next room, the rhythmic scrape of sandpaper as he smoothed the wings of his wooden bird. It was a sound I hadn't known I missed, the sound of life returning in small, ordinary ways. I turned back to the journal. Maybe forgiveness isn't about forgetting. Maybe it's about remembering without pain. I underlined the words twice. For a long time, I just sat there, listening to the house breathe, the creak of the old beams, the sigh of the sea wind through the window. It wasn't the same sound as before. It was richer now, wiser. I closed the journal and placed it on the shelf next to a framed photo, the only one that survived from the old house. It was of me holding Daniel and Leanne when they were small, all of us squinting into the sunlight. Back then, none of us knew how much the world could bend us, or how far love could stretch without breaking. The next morning, the world was painted gold again. The air smelled of wet soil and salt. Leanne was already outside, hanging laundry in the sun. Her hair glimmered as the breeze moved through it, and for a moment she looked like the child she once was, laughing, barefoot, alive. Daniel came out soon after, holding 2 cups of coffee. He handed me one and said, "You still take it black, right?" I nodded, smiling faintly. "Some things don't change." He sat on the steps beside me. We drank in silence, watching the sunlight climb across the garden. After a while, he said, "You know, I never understood why you named this place Grace House. It sounded churchy to me." I chuckled softly. "It's not about religion. Grace is what's left when everything else is gone." He nodded, staring into his cup. "I think I get it now." For a moment, neither of us moved. The wind brushed against us like a hand, gentle and forgiving. In the distance, the waves broke against the shore, a slow, endless rhythm, steady as breath. Leanne called out from the garden, "Daniel, the trellis needs you again." He smiled, shook his head, and stood up. "She's bossy, just like you." I smiled back. "Then you should listen." He laughed, a sound I hadn't heard from him in years, real, unguarded laughter. And as he walked down the steps toward his sister, I felt something loosen inside me, something that had been tight for far too long. They were different now. Older, slower, quieter. But maybe that's what time does. It sands the sharp edges, teaches us to speak in softer tones. I watched them from the porch as they worked together, their voices rising and falling in easy rhythm. And for a fleeting moment, I saw the ghosts of who we were. The young mother, the restless son, the stubborn daughter, all overlapping with who we had become. It wasn't forgiveness yet, but it was close. The wind shifted, carrying the scent of rosemary and sea spray. Somewhere in the garden, a bird landed, small, brown, alive. It perched on the edge of the trellis Daniel had built and sang, its voice sharp and clear against the quiet morning. And I whispered to myself, barely audible, "It's starting to heal."